Hello. Hi. So I'm here supposedly to talk about the future of genetic counseling. I apologize if this talk, I tried to make it more general, but it might end up a little US-centric because that's where I live. So I was thinking like what you probably expect to hear, you know, the things you know. There's going to be more counselors, there's going to be more job choices, there's going to be more specialty areas, there's going to be much more testing. You know that. You know what's coming. Waves of testing in the clinic, out of the clinic, real miracles, false miracles, snake oil, stem cells, chatbots. Where are we going to be in all this? I don't know. Thank you very much. I don't know, but let's sort of explore some of the choices we'll have. So in terms of where we are now, the first genetic counselor graduated from Sarah Lawrence, in 1971. The first board exam was 1981. Journal of Genetic Counseling launched in 92. Those are long ago steps at this point. Now this random job site ranked genetic counseling as the best job of 2018. We have arrived. In the US and Canada, the number of programs rose from fewer than 30 to over 50 in a span of 10 years. And it's not just about the body count. Described in Science 5 years ago, genetic counseling as primarily a Canadian-US field, now thriving in over 28 countries. There are new areas of practice and increasing presence in things like psychiatry, cardiology, infertility, and of course, the new field of genomic medicine. Other changes recently, back home, 27 of 50 states have licensure, which allows genetic counselors to practice independently. And we recently introduced a federal bill that would allow genetic counselors to bill for their services without a physician. So we are past our early milestones. We're in a rapid growth spurt. We are struggling for independence. Clearly, genetic counseling has reached its adolescent years. Okay, so that's where we are. There are teenagers. And what should we be when we grow up? Well, like other teenagers today, we're worrying a little bit about the world in which we are going to exist. What is it going to be? I mean, besides hot and wet. Where is it headed? I was trying to answer those questions, and I thought I needed to think a little bit more about what that world was going to be like. And I started to look at some news stories from the last few years, the last 4 or 5 years, that have struck me as one way or another as a harbinger of things to come. So here's my top 10. I'm a blogger. I do things like top 10s. In roughly chronological order, and I'm going to try to run through them kind of quickly. Starting with a miracle. This story was written in 2017, but the story dates to 2015, when Hassan, a 7-year-old Syrian refugee, ended up in a hospital in Germany. Hassan was diagnosed just after birth with severe EB, and at this point, 60% of his body had no skin on it at all. He was a mass of infected, open sores. And in so much pain, the child was begging his father to let him die. The doctors were considering a move to end-of-life care when they spoke to 2 researchers in Italy who wanted to try a brand new stem cell treatment that had never been used. They had trouble finding a patch of skin big enough to take from this kid that was intact. They found one on his groin. The Italian researchers isolated the stem cells, modified them genetically, growed them up, and transplanted the skin back on him. In 2016, this child went back to school. He plays sports. He's pain-free. Truly a miracle story, and the main point of it, we are genuinely at the dawn of an age of remarkable treatments and even cures. This story is also a miracle of sorts. It's about the first baby born from mitochondrial transplant therapy using the mother's nucleus and a donor egg to replace her mitochondria as a cure for mitochondrial disease. This is a sort of a miracle, but it's a bit more complicated, and I think of it kind of a parable for our time. This was done by a United States doctor for Jordanian parents in a Mexican clinic, because it's illegal to do this in the United States. There's so much to point out here. So the doctor, John Zhang, who did it, is not at all interested in mitochondrial disease, has no expertise in it. He's an IVF doctor, and he said, I'm not making this up and reading his mind, he wrote, that what he's interested in was learning how to do this so that he could use it in older mothers, which are a very big market, not in mitochondrial disease population, which is a very tiny niche market. So in that sense, this story is about medical need as the leading edge, enabling a wider use of technology, which I think is something we will see. And in fact, subsequently, as many of you probably know, there's been other babies born after this technique, and in these cases, the indication for it was that the mothers were infertile, older mothers with infertility. Also, the story says something about the limits of local regulation and the way in which the world is stratified, not by regions, but by money. And by what we lose when the work is done privately. Because in this case, there was very little follow-up. We were told, without anybody being able to confirm it, that the child had most of their DNA, most of their mitochondria from the donor egg and just a handful from the mother, but there's really been no follow-up. So, next story. This story features the Minion. See, I was trying to see, like, favor the home team here. The Minion from Oxford Nanopore, a little sequencer that has traveled to the front lines of the Ebola epidemic and with NASA to outer space. They say the next one that's coming is even smaller and works off your cell phone, the Smidgen. This device has no PCR, so it's suited to real-time exercises, which means it could be used for things like taking a snapshot of DNA expression from a single cell. So there's a quote I love by the Scottish bioinformatician Mick Watson from the University of Edinburgh, writing in the Opinionomics blog in 2014 about Minion. He said, "If you currently sat in front of a bunch of Minion data wondering how on earth you're ever going to make it do what you can do with your Illumina data, then go back in your lab, take the Minion, put it back in the box, and send it back to Oxford Nanopore. Seriously. Wondering how you can fit Minion into your existing workflows is like sitting in front of a spaceship and wondering how you're going to use it to commute to work. It's like sitting in front of a time machine and wondering if you could use it to get to the shops before they close. The potential applications of a mobile DNA sequencer are incredible." So, like, unlike the previous two generations, first in what we call next generation, which, by the way, that was dumb of us. It's second generation. The third and fourth generations are already here. The future generations of DNA technology are not going to be won by they're not going to have a single winner. We're going to have all different sorts of technologies with different functions and different strengths and weaknesses. Where will it go? To the bedside, certainly. To the mall. To schools. To spas. To private investigator apps on your phone. Remember that smidgen in your cell phone? Who knows? This story is about the first gene therapy ever approved for use. Yay, not so fast. Glybera in Europe in 2012. So this was for lipoprotein lipase deficiency, very rare. It took more than $100 million to bring it to market. European regulators wanted a clinical trial of 342 patients. The company pointed out there were only 250 patients with the disease in all of Europe. So they agreed instead to an open-label trial, a not blind trial, of only 27 people. And then they approved it, and they priced the drug at $1 million a patient. In 5 years it was on the market, they had exactly one patient. They considered bringing the drug, they wanted to bring it to the States to sort of widen the potential market, and the FDA's response was that they indicated they would require more follow-up yet, and the company decided, forget it, we're not throwing good money after bad, withdrawn it. It exists, but it's not on the market for anybody. It's no longer there. So the point here is we like to say rare diseases are individually rare and collectively common. But rare diseases are also individually rare and collectively very, very expensive. Individual treatments will not scale up, and cost is going to be through the roof, creating a situation where possibly there will be no treatment or treatment only for the very rich. Non-invasive prenatal screening, big story. According to this article, the doctors reported use of NIPS in younger women, so like routine use, not high-risk people, went from 35% in 2016 to almost 60% 1 year later. It's amazing. Essentially overnight transition from selective to routine use. Routine use of non-invasive screening has already reshaped prenatal care. The use of amnio and CVS dropped off like off a cliff in California. They had to change the standards they had for licensing people to do the amnio procedures because there weren't enough people for the students to learn on. It's left us scrambling for new solutions for our model of pretest counseling, and some of those new solutions include new technology. That's something we're working with right now. But also, it's just the beginning, because non-invasive technology is going to expand the range of what we can and will test for prenatally. And it's going to alter the calculus on people's willingness to act on that information by giving it to them earlier. It's a revolution in its earliest phases. Side note, even though this wasn't the point of the story, they still could not resist putting in a graphic that showed you, it could tell you if it was a boy or a girl. So I'm cheating a little bit here and counting as one of my 10. And a second story on routinization, because I think it's also important. This is Geisinger Health System doing a pilot study of 1,000 healthy patients, offering DNA sequencing, plan to extend it to all of their patients. Another type of routinization. So in 2018, the US soccer team dealt a terrible blow to Fox Sports by not making the World Cup tournament, after this Fox Sports had paid a fortune for the TV rights. And desperately, Fox Sports went and struck a deal with 23andMe to create this advertising campaign, Root for Your Roots. This idea was you should go to 23andMe and uncover your national identity and root for that team. Find your biological tribe. Ugh. Oh, I know, I am a genealogy curmudgeon, and it's such a nice, innocent hobby. Such a good Christmas present for Grandma. This story encapsulates what I don't like about how this industry portrays ancestry as who you are. Let's say you are, and truly are, 100% Italian. Mom, Italian dad, your Italian food. Your DNA is not 100% Italian DNA. It's not 50% Italian DNA. It is 99.9% human DNA. That somehow gets completely lost. The variable spots indicate that you had ancestors who lived in Italy a few hundred years ago. Great. Go back 1,000 years, and those same genes were somewhere else. In fact, probably many somewhere elses. Our tests pick a random moment in time and decree it real. Genealogy promises to take your cultural assumptions and replace them with science. But it's not. It's mapping science onto the cultural categories we already have. It's not taking stories and replacing them with science. It's mapping science onto existing stories, which is fun and harmless, except when those stories are about hatred and bigotry. But that barely happens. Good thing the world is not full of hatred and bigotry. Sorry, I'm a little bitter. So this story is about a lab in New Jersey. New Jersey, for those of you who are not from the States, is a little place across the river from New York, where I grew up, that made headlines. It's the home of Bruce Springsteen. That's really all you need to know. It made headlines, even here, these headlines are from here, last year, by offering a test for something. The headline says intelligence. The little print over where I've circled it in red says mental disabilities. The company said they were testing only for intellectual disabilities. Well, okay, we test for intellectual disabilities. We know how to do that. You look for pathogenic variants, structural variation, microdeletion syndromes, right? We've been doing that for a while. Got it, okay. But what are they using? They're using polygenic risk scores. Polygenic risk scores for intellectual disability. That's common genes. That's a summing up of the effect of many common genes. It's a really bad use of polygenic risk scores because common genes don't cause intellectual disability, or they wouldn't be common. In general, polygenic risk scores are, by the way, on a soapbox, a really bad way of differentiating between sibling embryos, which to begin with share 50% of their common genes. So the range of differences between them is going to be much smaller than the rest of the population. In addition, it's a very bad use of testing in embryos because traits are pleiotropic, and when you select for something, you're selecting against something else, and you don't really know what we're selecting for and we're selecting against. And if it's not IQ, and P.S. it's not, if it's not intellectual disabilities but IQ that they're trying to select for, that's trait testing. And does trait testing step over a line? Does it challenge, does it create a situation where we're wondering, like, aren't parents supposed to be unconditionally accepting of their children? Are they looking for too many specific things in a kid? These are really hard questions. So point one, polygenic risk scores are here. Point two, polygenic risk scores are here in this place, testing embryos. And this raises these hard questions, and who's going to answer these hard questions? Well, Genomic Prediction has a suggestion. They're talking, you talk to your genetic counselor. You guys have an answer? Okay. So, I love this story. So this story is simply about how weird genetics is. I picked this one. It could have been any one of a dozen. This story was about one egg that split at just the right moment. There were two sperms, so instead of creating polyspermy, it ended up with the egg split, and each one of the versions of the egg got fertilized by a different sperm, and you had two kids, one boy, one girl, that were half identical, half fraternal twins, which they discovered at some point along the line. I know, crazy, right? Genetics, you make rules, it breaks rules. Apparently, genetics is also a teenager. So mosaicism, chimerism, epistasis, it's always more complicated. And isn't that great? Oh, well, this one's not so great. This story reports on a pilot program in the United States this spring using DNA testing to try and identify fakers, people who were bringing across children at the border who weren't really their children. This morning, there's an article in the Times that literally says that this was the kind of program they turned to because his advisors told Trump that he wasn't allowed to shoot them in the legs, the immigrants trying to get across the border. So this was plan two. Yeah, it's a terrible idea, right? Testing people at the border, DNA testing people at the border. But let me just stick to this. Families, defining families by DNA testing is a bad idea because families are not about DNA. Families are, if you will forgive me for being sentimental, about love. Families have step-parents. Families have adoption. Families have misattributed paternity. They're still families. State-sponsored genotyping programs. That felt to me like something that could lead somewhere truly terrible. And it's not just the United States. China has made genetic testing, along with re-education camps, a feature of its attempt to control the Uyghurs, a Muslim minority population. A program of genetic surveillance called Physicals for All, so they wrapped it in healthcare, took genetic samples of this population to track them because they're a group that China was worried about their hostility to the state. In Israel, in what looks like it might be a more benign use, they were using genetic testing to see who was Jewish because in Israel, marriage is defined as a religious and not a state institution. So you have to get married in one religion or another. And if it's the Jewish religion you want to get married in, then you have to prove that you are Jewish to the satisfaction of the rabbinate. And some people were having trouble proving it, particularly groups that had lived in places like Russia, Soviet Russia, where for generations their families had hidden the fact they were Jewish, might not have the proper paperwork to prove it, and so they allowed them to use genetic testing instead, genetic testing to prove they were Jewish. But again, what does that mean? Is Jewishness genetic? What does it imply to define Judaism by genetic testing? Does that mean if a converted Jew is not a real Jew? Does that mean that someone, anyway. So it raises the question to me of whether a state-sponsored or state authority-sponsored program of genetic testing can ever be truly benign. It's my final story, the darker side of the age of miracles, and there are some miracles in this story, because 2 years ago, there was nothing at all to offer the families with children with SMA, and now there are 2 therapies, dueling therapies, Spinraza, a therapy that's injected twice a year, first year $750,000 and $375,000 in the US for every year thereafter, and a gene therapy, hopefully one time only, Zolgensma, priced in the US at $2.1 million per patient. Point 1, the fact that one insane price is a better deal, is a bargain compared with another insane price, is not actually very helpful. Point 2, theoretical models of what things are of cost are not always helpful in the real world situation. So the theoretical models like this one are built on perfect scenarios, only giving the drug to the patient with whom the outcome is most likely to be good, and a perfect outcome. Outcomes may be suboptimal, and once the drug is out there, someone like this young girl who was actually a little too healthy for the drugs, her insurance company wouldn't pay for them because she wasn't sick enough. So she was doing okay, but she was still sick. So her mother also wanted her to be able to get one of these 2 treatments. But the pricing model that was based around lethal disease and one-time cure didn't make sense. The other thing is, the one-time cure thing, we never really get to check that out, the lifetime cure, because we can't wait a lifetime to see before you use the drugs. So all of these things raise a lot of questions, but that's not really the reason I put this story in there. The reason I put this story in there is buried within it in a couple of lines where the parents had told that they knew the baby would have SMA and made the hard decision. They said many hard conversations and many tears. They opted to continue the pregnancy, in part because they had heard some hopeful things about new treatments. So this article had 320 comments after it, and many of them were exactly the comments you would think. You know, my thoughts and prayers are heartbreaking for you. Best wishes to your family. But like 25% of them were things like this. I'm going to read it. So apparently the parents made a conscious choice to bring a neurologically damaged baby into the world and now expect everyone to fess up. This is something inherently narcissistic and mentally sick about parents who do this. Who is going to take care of her when they are gone? Her brother and sister who didn't ask to be brought into this world, yet will probably find themselves having to take on this burden? How selfish, sick, and emotionally stunted are you? No one owes you anything. And this one. I had the deepest sympathy for the Sullivans until I read the part where they knew their baby was doomed to a terrible wasting disease, but continued the pregnancy anyway. How selfish and egotistical to assume that society should pay enough every year to completely support 10 entire families to treat their precious spawn. They made a choice to continue the pregnancy. If they want their child treated, they should pay for it themselves, or set up a GoFundMe to see if the forced birthers will put their money where their mouths are. 20% solid of 320 comments were along those lines. The parents knew, they made a choice, it was their choice. Please notice our own language of choice, weaponized. So, how do we make sense of all this? How do I make sense of all this? I don't know. Here's my thoughts about the decisions we face and maybe what we can do or what choices we have. Let me start with a hard truth. Many of the norms under which we practice will not endure. There will be much less pre-test counseling. There will be much more pre-symptomatic testing. There will be much more testing of minors for adult onset conditions. I don't have time, but all of that's going to happen. I mean, I don't have time to go into it, but there will be the option of prenatal and pre-implantation testing for a range of tests and conditions. So I really do believe, or hope, that we can change our practice and keep our values. Can we? I think so. First thing, we should stay a value-driven profession. I see applicants every year to Sarah Lawrence, dozens and dozens of them. They come through the door, and absolutely consistent with all of them, that they enter this field hoping to do some good in the world. It is a field that draws idealistic people. I've really rarely seen any other reason for people to be there. We should stay counselors. We should continue to individualize care to reflect each patient's own unique needs and goals, and recognize that information is only half of our job, and helping them adapt to that information is a part of the therapeutic process. We should push back, as we have always pushed back, on the narratives that make genetics dangerous, on genetic determinism, no gene for this, gene for that, on genetic tribalism, on stories that identify genetic differences as essential and defining. I love this quote from the Israeli psychologist Daniel Kahneman. He said, "No one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story." I was thinking about that the other day when I went to a talk on biography, and the biographer was talking about how we are people are a species that tells stories. And I think that's true. I think that might actually be the defining characteristic of humanity. We tell stories to understand things. I think my dog is super smart, but I'm not sure my dog tells stories. I think she's just in that moment. So this is something that genetic counselors really get about people. And if we get it, and we believe in it, and if we want to change behavior, we can't just understand how people work. We have to understand how they think and figure out how to talk to them. And if we want to get paid for it, we have to, and have our work respected, we need to expand the evidence base proving that that sort of genetic counseling changes outcomes. Walls. I'm generally not into building walls. But there needs to be a separation between what belongs in the clinic and what does not belong in the clinic. Ah, you're thinking, direct to consumer. Yes, let me let you in on a little secret. Genetic counselors are not uniformly friendly to direct to consumer genetic testing. But genetic information is going to be available everywhere, including direct to consumer, but that's a part of a bigger trend in medicine as well as genetics, including genetics, and includes a host of sources well beyond 23andMe and whatever is the next iteration of 23andMe. 1,000 sources of information. They're going to get genetic information online and from apps and from wearables. Remember the Minion? Yeah. And in this noisy world of information, genetic counselors need to be the experts and the honest brokers, not the salespeople. That's a part of our code of ethics, and it should be demanded of anyone who described what they're doing as genetic counseling. First of all, because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's our brand. If we're not that honest broker, we're just another source of information. I know there's a problem with trust in medical care, but I saw the most recent Gallup poll of the most trusted professions in the United States, and the top 3 were all medical professionals: nurses, doctors, pharmacists, in that order. So trust is diminished, but it's not at all gone. And that's despite the fact that people, they worry about the conflict of interest, and they worry about their doctor being impatient and not having enough time for them. But still, at some level, they go into those medical professionals and they think what they care about the most is my health and well-being, that they're not going to put anything else first. And we need to keep what happens in the clinic to medical issues that have proven clinical utility and push back on things that are just hype. Stay with the science. But also, we need to provide entry from people who get information from other sources into that clinical setting. And right now, we're not doing a very good job of that. Specialization. Okay, so genetics is, and I say will be, a profession for the jack of all trades. Genes, talked about it before, pleiotropic, epistasis. There's a reason why we stopped calling them unanticipated findings. because you got to anticipate findings that have nothing to do with the inquiry that you've started out with. That's what genetics is like, and specialization is key right now to bringing genetics into the clinical setting in a lot of specialties. And it's terrific, but we have to question how much of what we're doing now is an early days phenomenon. Some is. Whatever is routine is not eventually going to be our job. It's going to get absorbed into practice. The way that BRCA testing, certain types of testing are now being absorbed into regular practice. So what stays ours? What's good for us? What stays ours? Well, there's three things that doctors won't learn to handle. The rare and the weird, and I said there's a lot of that. The emotionally complex, and there's a lot of that. And things that they're not their own specialty. Those are our bread and butter. And so for those reasons, I would make the argument that specialize away but continue to train genetic counselors as generalists. So I show this quote every year to my students. That's by Sheldon Reed, the man who coined the term genetic counseling. It says genetic counseling is a type of social work entirely for the benefit of the whole family without direct concern for its effect upon the state or politics. That's his definition of genetic counseling. And I like them to contemplate how that makes no sense whatsoever as a definition of genetic counseling. Like, why on earth would that be? Like, if someone comes up to you in the elevator and like, you're a genetic counselor, what's that? I'm like, no one would ever say, I'm kind of a social worker with no concern about state or politics. But it's important because we were born at a moment where the sensitivity of the world, where we had to respect the sensitivities of the world that had just torn itself apart over issues of nationalism and taken hatred of genetically defined groups to new levels that included annihilation. And so we had to be a little bit careful. Controversy was our birthright, and controversy, politics, is not going away. Genetics will always be subject to abuse and misuse. You may have seen once like this was a relic of the past, but the last few years say otherwise. Now, for the first time, we have the ability to do population-level genetic screening. Where will that lead? What does that mean for us? The things we can do. We absolutely know we need more diversity in our field, and we know more diversity in our databases. And I'll tell you this, you know this. We have to be incredibly sensitive to what we say and how we say it. This is one thing that's come out. I now believe in political correctness. Be careful. Be careful about the article and the headline. Be careful about the discussion session and the press release. And be very careful about using race and ethnicity as a proxy for genetics, because it is not. One final way in which we push back against the use of genetic determinism as a narrative, be sure that our excitement about genes, and genes are super sexy, doesn't drive environment and chance out of the conversation, which it easily can. But we know that they're important, and we can't let a genetic test erase that. Talk a little bit about reproductive genetic testing. Reproductive genetic testing is controversial for a reason. Offering a test is not a neutral act. It makes a judgment. It makes a judgment about what we value and about what we fear. And thus far, we've really gotten off easy. Thus far, we've been able to deflect the ethical quandary associated with reproductive genetic testing by assuring ourselves that we are not the decision makers. We facilitate autonomous decision making by parents. They choose. Inherent in this, however, has been the understanding that we can only test for a limited number of things, and that the timing of testing dictated that very few parents would use this technology for any frivolous reasons. Well, that's all about to change. People are going to get tons more information, up to and including exome sequencing, and it's going to be available in some ways pre-implantation, and some people early in pregnancy. And what parents want may very well exceed our comfort zone. Do we want to leave that comfort zone? I mean, sometimes you have to stay in the box So are we willing to offer anything? Do what the market tells us to do? Or are we going to set limits? And can we set limits? One use enables another. Think about this description of genetic counselors from a 1999 book by British writer Brian Appleyard. Non-directive counseling and a free market in genetic technologies become the answers because they require no general statement of principles, only the careful cultivation of moral indifference. Provocative, but is he entirely wrong? Finally, subject really closest to my heart, inequities in healthcare. A huge problem in the United States, maybe a little bit different problem in other places, but it's a problem everywhere, and as costs as these very high-priced therapies come on, I believe it will be more of a problem everywhere. Genetic medicine will deepen these inequities if we can't find a way to get people access. And it's more than just an individual problem. Simultaneous developments in many areas are opening up the possibility of reducing or removing risk for many genetic diseases. Preconception, people can do screening. That's much more popular in the last few years to identify potential inherited risks. Preconception screening costs money, and it also takes an educated and organized person to do it. Pre-implantation testing and embryo selection protect the next generation, getting more and more common. I really would like to see more numbers on this, but this part of IVF has grown gangbusters in the last few years. People are, partly because they're doing the preconception screening, and partly because they're just getting more smart about it, realizing that if they have genes in their family they're worried about, and they have the money to spend on it, they can prevent those genes from being handed down in their family. Get rid of them. Prenatal testing and termination are available less expensively, but rely on access to testing and access to termination. So there are both legal, in some cases, and cultural barriers. And access to these very high-priced treatments and cures, very expensive, yet to be seen what kind of access there's going to be. So my concern is the result of this is we will decrease the amount of genetic disease, which is the outcome we're looking for, but we'll do it in a very uneven way. And genetic disease, so some populations will essentially minimize their children's risk of genetic diseases, and in other populations you may see the risk being the same as it ever was or very close to it. In the United States, at least I'd say, within our country, very great regional differences. And I use the word regional somewhat incorrectly there, because if you have money, you can move out of your region. You don't have to move. You can lift yourself up and go somewhere else and get whatever it is you need. So it's really a difference that affects vulnerable populations more than regional populations. So what does all this happen? It changes genetic diseases from being the epitome of something that could happen to anyone into something that only happens to certain people. This is what I call the ghettoization of genetic disease. And what could happen if we find that? I mean, I think we've already seen it somewhat with Down syndrome. What happens then? Will we have an empathy gap? Will people's empathy for families and individuals with genetic disease be the same when they aren't personally at risk? They don't feel their families to be at risk. I'm concerned that it will not be. Remember those quotes. Your choice, you could have done it differently, you take care of it yourself. Society shouldn't be on the hook. There'll be a loss of the best voices we had for advocacy, because the natural advocates are people with money and education, people who aren't struggling to keep their heads underwater when they have a child with genetic disease. Will they be there for those people if they don't feel themselves at risk? Will they be interested in advocating for resources and services, or just for the higher priced cures? And finally, maybe most importantly, the stigma. So I like to draw the comparison between lung cancer and breast cancer. We have all of this activation around breast cancer, right? Like football players, they wear pink ribbons and so on for breast cancer. The biggest cancer killer of women in the United States is lung cancer, not breast cancer. You really don't see football players out there with ribbons for their mom for lung cancer, because lung cancer has a little stigma attached to it, doesn't it? kind of, maybe not everybody, just like this. Maybe, you know, but you kind of brought it on yourself. Maybe you kind of brought it on yourself. Is everything going to turn to that? Maybe your parents weren't careful enough. Maybe they didn't do what they should do. It's a scary thought for those of us who go into this field to do the world some good, isn't it? Raises the possibility of turning genetic medicine into a force that makes the world less fair. And that's like the worst outcome I can think of. So what can we do? What can we do as genetic counselors? Well, we can fight for access. We can fight for education, screening for all, for reproductive rights. And we can fight really hard not to have anybody treated like that child in those comments I was described, to make sure that, that no one is ever held accountable for having a genetic disease and stigmatized. It may not be enough, but I'd say it's going to be a part of our job to do what we can. Thank you very much. 6 minutes. I told Anna I was going to take every one of the 45 minutes, but I'm 6 minutes early. What do you want to do? Do you have any questions? I can't see. That's it? I had all the answers? Do you have any arguments? Do you want to totally disagree with me? I like arguments. I'm from New York. Okay, sure you can use the time.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
What really struck me is embracing that shift from supportive, and dare I say it, passive, to being more forceful. You know, is now the time that we actually start to say, no, you know, we're not happy with testing for this. No, we do believe this. Our moral framework is this. And this whole sort of idea of, I know we've been debating for years about the tension between being directive and non-directive, but is it time for us as a profession to be so much more directive in our own moral compass?
You know, I think, first of all, you, meaning this country, is much better equipped to do that than we are. And I wish we were in the same position.
Why do you say that? Because
you have the Human Fertilization and Embryo Authority,
Okay.
you have them with actual...
And because we have access to termination of pregnancy?
I mean, I suppose that a lot of this can... So I suppose a lot of this can take place in private settings, and we're not going to be able to control what takes place in private settings. But I did try to draw a distinction between what takes place, you know, what takes place in the clinical setting. Because when it takes place in the clinical setting, we're calling it medicine, right? So then we're saying that maybe these differences between people, we're saying one is better than the other. We're really like voting if we offer a test. I joke around with my students that, like, you know, like nobody walks in and says, well, we just noticed on the test the child's going to be a redhead. I don't know how you feel about that. You don't know what to do. And, like, you know, it would be making a statement. If you were like, ginger, I don't know, you know. So we can't control that things are going to be offered in private settings. But I was trying to differentiate between private and clinical settings. And so my thought to that is, yes, I think we will be unhappy with ourselves if we don't make a stand and we just sort of say, well, we'll do whatever the market demands, because the market is going to demand some pretty hinky things. Yeah. It's not good.
I think in policy we have fudged it many times in terms of offering services for serious genetic conditions without a very clear description of what we mean by that. And we talk about the patient choice and the patient's perception of what's serious, but without actually coming down hard with a strong view on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah. The microphone heading its way to you.
Hello. On one of your slides, you mentioned that we need to diversify our workforce. Have you got any ideas how we can go about doing that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
On one of your slides, it mentioned that we should diversify our workforce.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you've got any ideas of how we can achieve that.
Yeah, I do. Well, again, I don't know and on here, but something we're working on a lot at Sarah Lawrence, so I do have some ideas. We looked into it a little bit, and we found that whereas our typical our typical applicant was, white, young woman, minority students often made up their minds about what they were going to do much earlier. That was the research we found. And so instead of just trying to go to college science students, we tried to move it back to high school science students and introduce them to genetic counseling, get people from minority areas interested in genetic counseling. And we have shown some steady improvement. And then we just recruit and we work with students hard sometimes if if there's somebody that, it's just a slog to try and it's not like there's something where you can turn a spigot and overnight we have all of these applicants. But we've been working very hard to increase every year the number from underrepresented minorities, including men. Yeah. But that's not the main point of it, is it? Yeah.
Got time for one last comment or question? No, you're a quiet bunch. Oh, Nat. Yeah, there's the mic.
I really love that talk. It's quite encouraging to think that we've got all of these skills that are still there that we're going to continue to keep using and keep going back to the values that we've got, which is basically keep our patients safe, help them explore their family situation a bit more, communicate, and so on. And so I'm interested in what you were saying about access to services. And I know in the States, obviously, it's quite different to how we've got it over in the UK. But it's about engaging with different kind of ethnicities and so on. And so have you got projects that you've been doing to kind of outreach work to education programs and things to specific communities, or how, because you know how you're saying about getting into schools and high schools and so on. Do you do the same thing out in the community?
No, it's a great idea. I mean, I wish I could say that I've done these things, but no. It is the idea that has preoccupied me for the last 3 or 4 years, is this idea of are we headed in that direction? What I outlined, the ghettoization piece. And I would say I'm only in the earliest stages of conversations with people about what concretely do you do. Right now, I feel like all I'm doing, and I do it a lot, is sounding an alarm bell, because I think that people worry about the wrong thing. I think there's a lot of people out there going designer babies, they're gonna pick for intelligence, they're gonna have different color eyes. And I'm like, I don't care what color eyes your kids are. I really don't. If we had a run of babies with purple eyes, it would be okay with me. It'd be a little weird. But I think people's thinking is like horror movie shaped, right? It's like, it's gonna be like Frankenstein, blah, blah, blah. And they're missing the thing that's happening right under our noses. The one thing we don't think of as a designer baby, a baby that's healthy. There's nothing unusual about not being healthy. But there's really nothing more incredible than not being healthy, right? It's a giant sea change, and nobody's talking about it. And I've seen it on a personal level, and I've seen it on a statistical level, and I think it's kind of undeniable when you think about it that this is where we're headed at the moment. And honestly, I'd love to hear everybody's views on what could you do to change this. But that's the piece, that's the hard piece, and I get the easy piece. I don't have an answer. I don't have a simple answer for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Let's move on to the next session and thank Laura.
Thank you.